Okay, so back to what we were doing here. So, okay, so these are the terms of, so the concessions that the North made, I'm sorry, these are the concessions that the South made to the North, and these are the concessions made to the North by the South. So California is admitted as a free state. We said there's parts that were disputed. Remember, I showed you earlier in that other map, there was parts that were disputed by Texas and New Mexico, and they're going to be surrendered to New Mexico. And the slave trade is outlawed, trade, not slavery, in DC. Then all the other areas are supposed to be open to popular sovereignty. Texas receives $10 million from the federal government as compensation for all the war that was fought in that area. And of course, the biggest one, again, is the fugitive slave law. Okay. And here's Henry Clay. Okay. The great compromiser. Okay. We kind of said this already. Okay. So the compromise. Okay. So yes, this last point here is important. Some people believe that the Compromise of 1850 and that fugitive slave law really kind of lit a fire under the Northerners, that they really wanted to keep the Union together and thought that that this something had to be done. They just really, it kind of brought things to a head a little bit for them, because they became very upset about the intrusion that it caused in the North. Okay. All right, so popular sovereignty. So I said popular sovereignty is when you, the people, decide. So it's voting on something. And in this particular case, it is whether or not to have slavery in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. So Stephen Douglas is a member of Congress. He actually runs for the position of Senator of Illinois against Abraham Lincoln. And they have a series of debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and Douglas actually wins because this is before the 17th Amendment was passed, which says that the U.S. senators are selected by the people. Previously, they were selected by the state senate, and Stephen Douglas was a wealthy, well-connected man, and Abraham Lincoln kind of came from humble means. So he didn't know all those state senators. He wasn't in that crowd, and so Douglas won. So that kind of shows us how unfair that was, and that's one of the things that kind of pushes people for the 17th Amendment. But that won't be passed until the Progressive Era. Okay, so that just a little background on Douglas. And Stephen Douglas, if you were watching the debates, you would think that Lincoln won because he does a better job, but Douglas just wins because of his connection. So Stephen Douglas, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was his idea. And basically it repeals the Missouri Compromise because it says the areas of Kansas and Nebraska are going to be open to popular sovereignty. And what did the Missouri Compromise say? The Missouri Compromise said anything above the 3630 line would be free. And guess what? That both Kansas and Nebraska are above the 3630 line. So it negates the Missouri Compromise. And this is going to cause a lot of problems, so much so that Douglas really is never chosen to run for president. He never has success in running for president because he was kind of stained by this whole thing, his reputation, because what ends up happening is the Kansas-Nebraska Act starts the fighting. A lot of historians believe that the Civil War really started. Now, it doesn't really. The first shots aren't fired here. Technically, the war really doesn't start until the southern states secede from the Union, and Fort Sumter is where they have the first shots fired. However, some people say it's kind of like with the American Revolution. This is a comparison you can make, actually. You know how with the American Revolution they say sometimes Crispus Attucks is the first casualty. He was killed in the Boston Massacre. Did the war really start then? No, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act starts as early as 1854. The war doesn't start till 1861, but people in Kansas and in Nebraska start fighting. And there's like civil war there, and it just literally continues and spills into the Civil War. So technically, there is fighting here already. So I can see why some historians do say that. Okay. So anyway, so they open this up to popular sovereignty, and they're like, let the people decide if they want slavery. So guess what's going to happen? everybody who's pro-slavery is going to run to that area to vote for it, and everybody who's an abolitionist who's anti-slavery is going to run to that area to vote slavery away. So they start literally fighting each other and killing each other in the area. So here's the 3630 line with the Missouri Compromise, and above it is Kansas and Nebraska. Now, Stephen Douglas's thought was, well, Nebraska's so far north, they'll probably vote slavery down, and that will be free. And in Kansas, they'll probably vote for slavery because it's a little closer to the South. And so it'll balance out. But that is not what happens, because people like all these abolitionists from here rush out to try and vote it away, and all these people here rush out to try and vote for it, and they're all kind of like getting each other's way and fighting. So it's kind of a mess. Okay. We're going to talk about the rise of the Republican Party. We'll come back to that. All right. So meanwhile, what is making we know that slavery puts you in a bad situation economically. So as we're getting closer to the Civil War, you see that the South is at a disadvantage. They do not have a very dynamic or diverse economy. Everything is based on slave labor and cotton. And when that goes away during the war, they're going to really be debilitated. So we'll talk about that. Meanwhile, in the North, things are booming. A lot of cities are getting bigger and stronger, and look, if you look at the railroads, way more railroad track has been laid down and canals for that matter, in the North than in the South. And we learned in the War of 1812 that if you can't get your troops and supplies around very quickly, you're going to be at a disadvantage. And that's a huge part of the Civil War. So we'll talk about this again, but look at, mobilizing people up here is going to be a lot easier than it will be in the South. Okay. And the railroad is really growing during this time period. Okay. Agriculture. All right. And also to other political parties that come up. We've already talked about the Know Nothings. They were anti-Catholic, so anti-Irish, anti-immigrant. And the reason it's called that is because it was a secretive group, and people would ask, it was a very political, like a political party, and people would ask about it, and they wanted to keep it kind of secret, I guess, because it wasn't nice. They were doing things that were sort of against a lot of the newcomers, and they would ask people about it, and they would say, I don't know anything about it, so I know nothing. So they called it the Know Nothing Party. And there's also a big push too, girls. I think I mentioned this to you, that there's a lot of white people in the South who are against slavery, not because they want the slaves to be free and live among them. It's not because they're bleeding heart abolitionists and they feel slavery is immoral. It's because of the economic impact of slavery. So if you're just a regular white guy trying to get a job on a farm, you can't. Who can compete with slave labor? The big plantations that have a couple hundred slaves, there's not that many of them, but they would have employed hundreds of white workers, and they're not. So this gentleman, Hinton R. Helper, was a regular yeoman farmer, like a regular guy. But he, at one point, I think the story was his parents died, and he was sent to live with a wealthier uncle who got him a bit of an education. So he has seen both sides of it. He had been not so wealthy, but yet he was a little bit more educated than most yeoman farmers. So he wrote a piece called The Impending Crisis in the South, and that should really be in italics. And he wrote that piece, and he did a lot of research, and it has a lot of data that shows the problem of slave labor as far as on the economy for all the other people. So just the regular yeoman, like average farmer, is really going to struggle trying to compete with the in the economy that is in the South. I told you, most people are that guy. Most people are 3/4 of the population in the South don't own any slaves. Some people own a couple, but it's really hard to compete with the big plantations. And to him, the impending crisis in the South was he says that the person who suffers the most in slavery is the average white man who can't compete economically. So of course that's offensive to slaves, but he made an argument that a lot of people listened to, probably because he was a white Southerner. But his point of view, so girls, I would know his point of view in case it comes up, in case you get an excerpt of that. His point of view is that economically, slave labor is hurting the South, and thereby hurting the average yeoman farmer, okay, which most people are. Anti-Catholic, is this anti-Catholic stuff? Yeah. Okay, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So girls, they call, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, they call Kansas Bleeding Kansas, because literally people are murdering each other and fighting. So this is the dawn of the Republican Party. So in the election of 1856, you see people actually run as Republicans. This is the death of the Whigs. The Whigs kind of disappear. They don't totally, I mean, there are still guys who are Whigs, but they are absorbed by, usually they're absorbed by the Republican Party. The Republican Party absorbs a lot of different smaller political groups that kind of disappear. And this slashes the Democrats a little bit, that's Kansas-Nebraska Act, because Douglas was a Democrat. So this kind of weakens them because it doesn't go over well. It causes a lot of problems, and it kind of stains him, as I said. Okay. Who runs in the election of 56? So James Buchanan, who's actually from Pennsylvania, he's going to win. He is the bachelor president. He was never married. And he was from Lancaster, and he does win. He had been around in politics for a long time, and he is against Fillmore, who is running now on the American ticket, and Fremont, who had been a war hero in the Mexican-American War, runs as a Republican. So this is the first time a Republican is running. Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1860 will be the first time a Republican wins. So for that reason, Abraham Lincoln is considered the father of the Republican Party, much like Jackson, who was the father of the modern Democratic Party, because he's the first one who wins that position. So you see the Republicans here, but we will not see a winner until later. Now, Lincoln says, not Lincoln, I'm sorry. The South says in the next election, if a Republican wins, we are going to secede from the Union. And that's what they will do in 1860. They don't do it here. They said later. So they don't quite get there yet. But the Republican ideal is we do not want to see slavery spread, and we do not want to break apart the Union over it. We need to figure out a way to stay together. Okay, this is one other thing I want to talk about. Then I'm going to probably run out of time and I have to do one more recording, so I'm sorry. But basically this, girls, this is, you might see this. I've seen DBQs and short answers with this picture, but basically there's these two guys. This is Charles Sumner here, and this is Preston Brooks. So what ends up happening is Preston Brooks, wait, I'm sorry. So this is Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner is from Massachusetts, and these guys are both, one is a senator, one's in the House. I think Sumner was a senator, and Preston Brooks was in the House. And basically Sumner got up one day and gave a speech on how horrible slavery is, and he equates it to almost like prostitution, the way you own people, and he insults all Southerners. And Preston Brooks has an uncle who's in the Senate, and Charles Sumner basically says his uncle is like almost like an owner of prostitutes, being an owner of slaves, and he says filthy things, not filthy, but to a Southern gentleman, the way he speaks about slavery, they were highly insulted. So he took his cane and beat this man literally almost to death on the Senate floor. So this is another example of how dividing and polarizing slavery is in Congress, that two gentlemen can't even have a conversation about it without leading to almost killing this guy. So this ends up being a whole big thing. And here's the thing. Oh no, that's Dred Scott. So, but I would know this story. So Preston Brooks was hailed by Southerners as a hero, and Charles Sumner was literally out of work for years. It took him years to recover, and he does finally come back later. But this was very dividing for the North and the South. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and do one more recording.